He was not just serial killer but far worse, a sick tongue collector. But it wasn't always like that. Thomas didn't start as a monster. No, once upon a time he was just a father, living in the small, unassuming house on the edge of town. His two children, Amelia and Marcus, didn't know anything other than the quiet, unsettling life he had created for them. They didn't understand the way their father's eyes would glint when he stared at someone, like he could already see their soul, already know what they were worth. They didn't understand that their home was more prison than sanctuary. And they certainly didn't understand the significance of the basement door that was always locked. On most days their father wasn't home. He would disappear for hours, sometimes even days, without a word. When he was home he was distant, never quite looking anyone in the eye. It was as though he was always thinking about something else, always detached, his mind consumed by some dark secret. Amelia and Marcus tried their best to live normal lives, play, learn, do as children do. But there was always an underlying sense of dread. The house, the quiet, the way their father watched them, it all felt like something was wrong. One evening when they were just children, something shifted. They had been playing in the living room, Amelia with her favorite stuffed bunny and Marcus stacking his blocks like a little architect. Their father had been unusually quiet that night. Thomas never spoke much to them, not unless he had to, but this time it was different. There was an odd tension in the air, something heavy, as though the house itself held its breath. Then the sound came. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even a shout. It was muffled, soft, like someone was trying desperately to hold in their fear. Amelia glanced up, her small hands frozen mid-motion, eyes wide as she looked to Marcus. Marcus too was staring at the door. They both knew that sound, too well. It came from the basement. They were too young to understand everything, but they knew enough to feel the dread crawling up their spines. Their father had told them never to go near the basement, that it was dangerous, that it was where the grown-ups went. But tonight something felt different. Amelia could hear her heart beating loudly in her chest, and she could feel Marcus's small hand gripping her wrist. "Stay here," she whispered to him, even though she wasn't sure what was going on. Slowly she stood up, her feet silent on the creaky floorboards. She didn't want to go, but something was pulling her to the basement door, something that felt like a magnet, a force that she couldn't fight. With her breath caught in her throat, Amelia reached for the doorknob. It was cold under her fingers, as though it had been waiting for her to open it. The air felt stale, heavy, as she pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. What she saw turned her stomach. Thomas was standing over a man, his back to her. The man was hunched over, trembling, his clothes torn, but it was the blood that caught Amelia's attention first. There was so much of it, pooling around the man's body, staining the floor, the walls. And then she saw it. The victim's mouth. No, his lips were gone. The skin of his mouth had been sliced open with precision, but it wasn't just the wounds that made Amelia's skin crawl. It was the way her father was holding something in his hands, something small, wrapped carefully in a bloody cloth. He looked down at it, almost lovingly, as if it were a precious treasure. The man, still alive but broken, tried to cry out. But no sound came from his throat, nothing but a raspy wheeze. His tongue was gone, taken in a manner so precise that it almost seemed surgical. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Amelia's breath hitched as she stepped back, trying to pull herself away from the door. But the floorboard creaked beneath her feet, a loud snap in the otherwise quiet house. Thomas turned around, his cold eyes locking with hers. There was no anger in them. No surprise. He wasn't mad. He wasn't scared. He was pleased. "Amelia," he said softly, his voice smooth like honey, "you shouldn't be down here." Her heart raced, but she stood still, unable to look away from the bloodied scene. The man on the floor was barely breathing, his eyes wide with fear. But Thomas wasn't concerned with the man anymore. His eyes were focused on Amelia. He smiled, slowly, like a predator who had just spotted prey. "You see, Amelia," he began, his voice dark, "words are weakness. They are tools for the weak to communicate their desires, their emotions. But when you take someone's voice, when you silence them, you take away their power, their freedom, their ability to control their own fate. Do you understand?" Amelia didn't answer, but her legs trembled. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, to wake up from this nightmare. But she couldn't move. She couldn't look away from her father's dark smile. "This," he continued, holding up the bloody tongue, "is the true power. This is what makes them helpless. This is what makes them ours." A chill ran down Amelia's spine. She had never seen her father like this. He wasn't just a father anymore. He wasn't even a man. He was a monster, a sadistic creature who relished in the suffering of others. "Do you want to help, Amelia?" he asked, his voice soft and coaxing as if asking her to play a game. "You'll understand soon enough. Just like your mother did." Her stomach churned. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him, but her mind was screaming at her to run, to escape. He stepped closer, holding out the bloodied cloth as if it were a gift. But Amelia didn't take it. She couldn't. The smell of iron, of blood, made her dizzy. "You'll understand, my dear," he said, his voice filled with strange affection. "The power of silence. You'll be part of the ritual soon enough." Before she could process what he meant, her brother, Marcus, appeared behind her, his small hand tugging at her sleeve. She turned to him, her eyes wide with terror. He didn't say anything, but his face was pale, his lips trembling. Thomas watched them both, his smile never faltering. "It's time you both learned the truth," he murmured. And that was when Amelia realized, this was more than just a ritual. It was a belief. It was something twisted inside their father, something deep in his soul that had poisoned their lives forever. And in that moment she knew that her childhood was over. The man on the floor, his body trembling in agony, wasn't the only one whose voice would be taken. It was the beginning of something much darker. The beginning of a twisted legacy that would haunt the children forever. And the beginning of the ritual that would bind them to their father's madness. The media went wild when the authorities finally raided the Hargrove house. It wasn't just another arrest. It was a story that felt too unreal, too sickening to be true. Thomas Hargrove, the man known to his children only as their father, was captured at last after years of evading justice. He was arrested in the very house where he had built his twisted empire, his collection of trophies, the tongues of his victims, hidden away in cold, glass jars, meticulously preserved. They were his trophies, his symbols of dominance. The world finally learned about the horrors the Hargrove family had been living through. The police discovered it all, his methods, his obsession, his vile ritual. It was all there, in the basement, the room that had once been forbidden to the children. And the walls of that room, now splattered in red, told a story of suffering, pain that no one could have ever imagined. For years, the victims were silenced, their voices stolen before they could ever cry for help. Thomas Hargrove believed that by taking away their tongues, he could break their spirit, control their very essence. But the most chilling part wasn't the blood, nor the gruesome trophies. It was the children. Amelia and Marcus were found in separate rooms, isolated, terrified, but oddly composed. They weren't covered in blood, nor did they seem to show signs of the trauma that had undoubtedly taken place in that house. They were the perfect picture of silence. Amelia was 13 at the time, her brown eyes too wise for her age. She stood silently, staring at the police officers, as if their presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. Marcus, at only 9, clung to her side. But both children seemed distant, as though they had long accepted the horrors of their home. They didn't cry, didn't scream. They merely stood as cold and motionless as statues. The authorities placed them in separate foster homes, assuming the trauma had left deep scars on their minds. The media turned their story into a sensation. The Hargrove children, raised by a notorious murderer, now orphans. Everyone assumed the nightmare had ended. Yet, what the world didn't know was that Thomas's influence didn't die with him. It lingered like an unshakable shadow, weaving its way into the very core of the children's beings. The silent indoctrination had worked too well. They carried his twisted beliefs deep inside them, like a poison in their veins. The walls of their minds had been built by him. No one knew that better than they did. Years passed. The siblings grew up in their respective foster homes, but the truth of their father's legacy remained. Amelia's new family was kind, well-meaning, but the shadows of her past never quite left her. She was quiet, reserved, and perfectly behaved, a child who seemed to always have everything under control. But beneath the surface, a storm raged. Her thoughts were consumed with her father's teachings. His voice echoed in her mind, telling her over and over again that silence was power, that taking voices meant taking control. Marcus, too, lived his life as though the past never happened. He was adopted by a family that provided him with everything he could ever need: love, attention, and the promise of a bright future. He excelled in school, made friends easily, and appeared to be the picture of normalcy. But inside, the storm brewed just as fiercely as it did for Amelia. The connection between them was never severed. They were bound by something far darker than blood. Despite being in separate homes, the bond between the siblings was never truly broken. They communicated in ways that only they could understand. Amelia would sometimes write him letters, though the words seemed to never say much at all. She didn't need to explain, he always knew. They both knew that something had been left unfinished. The legacy of their father was like a virus in their veins. It wasn't something that could be removed. It was something that would have to be fulfilled. The years went by, but the children never truly grew up. Amelia, now in her 20s, was a quiet woman, intelligent, controlled, with a calm demeanor that could easily deceive anyone who looked at her. People trusted her. She worked as a graphic designer, living a life that appeared to be normal, even successful. But in her quiet moments, when she was alone, her father's words whispered in her mind. The power of silence. The power of control. Her thoughts always drifted back to that moment in the basement, to the blood, to the thrill she saw in her father's eyes. And she knew deep down that there was a part of her that had craved it. The idea of taking someone's voice, of rendering them helpless, felt too familiar, too right. It was a craving she couldn't ignore. Marcus, too, had grown up with the same empty ache. He had moved away, gone to college, and become a successful young man. His charm was undeniable. People were drawn to him without him even trying. He knew exactly what to say and when to say it. He had a way with people, a way of making them trust him, follow him. He was charismatic, always in control. But underneath that polished exterior, something dark stirred. He couldn't ignore it. He knew that one day it would rise. The legacy would be complete. It wasn't until one fateful evening that the siblings found each other again. The world had moved on, and so had they. Amelia had buried her past deep within herself. Marcus, too, had pretended that the years spent in silence hadn't shaped him. But they hadn't truly moved on. They never would. The reunion was strange, almost surreal. Felt like a dream. Amelia was sitting alone in her apartment one evening when she received a call from Marcus. His voice, though calm, carried an unsettling undertone. He was coming to see her. And when he arrived, the look in his eyes made her stomach churn. He wasn't the same boy who had clung to her side years ago. He was taller now, his jaw sharper, his expression colder. There was something almost predatory about the way he moved, the way he watched her. "I've been thinking," he began, sitting down across from her, his eyes never leaving hers. "About what we left behind. What we've been running from. And, Amelia, I think it's time to finish what Dad started." She froze. His words hit her like a jolt of electricity. She had known deep down that this day would come, but hearing him say it out loud made her blood run cold. "I've brought something with me," Marcus said, his lips curling into a smile that was both charming and chilling. He reached into his bag, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Amelia's heart raced. She didn't need to see what was inside. She knew. "I found someone," Marcus said softly, his voice like velvet, "someone who won't be able to scream." Amelia's eyes flickered with recognition. The familiar hunger flared inside her, the same hunger that had been festering since she was a child. The same hunger that her father had nurtured. She didn't know what she was expecting, but it wasn't this. The silence between them was deafening. Neither of them said anything for what felt like an eternity, and yet, neither of them needed to. The time had come. The legacy of their father, the dark teachings he had instilled in them, had finally come full circle. The air was thick with anticipation. Amelia couldn't tear her eyes away from her brother as he slowly unwrapped the cloth, revealing what was hidden inside. The small bundle was lifeless, tied and bound. The figure in front of them was a woman, her skin pale, her eyes wide with terror, but her voice, gone. The air around them felt suffocating, as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Amelia stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Her brother's smile, sharp and knowing, never wavered. He placed the woman in front of her, like a twisted gift, carefully untying the ropes that had bound her, letting her fall to the floor in a heap. "Take a good look," Marcus murmured, his voice low and steady. "This is what silence looks like." The woman trembled, her wide eyes darting around the room as though she were trying to escape, but there was nowhere to run. She had been carefully chosen, carefully brought here for this moment, and the fear in her eyes made the entire room feel colder. Amelia couldn't move. The strange, unrelenting pull of the past was too strong. Her father's lessons echoed in her mind, louder than ever before. Words are weak. Control comes from silence. Only those who take voices can truly command. Those words had once been just a lesson, something to be whispered in the shadows. But now they were alive. They danced in her thoughts like an uncontrollable fire, feeding on the fear in front of her. She had been trained for this, shaped by years of isolation and torment. She knew the power of silence, the power of control. And yet, the reality of what she was seeing now, the woman bound and speechless, broken, sent a shiver down her spine. Felt wrong, but at the same time it felt like home. Amelia slowly knelt beside the woman, her eyes scanning the trembling figure. There was a moment of hesitation, a quiet pause, and then she reached out, her fingers brushing against the woman's mouth. It was bloodied, raw, and sore from where Marcus had cut it open. The woman gasped, the only sound she could make, her chest heaving with panic. Amelia looked up at her brother, her eyes cold and unblinking. Marcus stood a few steps away, watching her intently, as if waiting for her to make the final decision. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice steady but with a hint of something darker, something triumphant. Amelia didn't answer. She didn't need to. There was no need for words anymore. She stood up, her gaze locked with her brother's, and a silent understanding passed between them. It was a connection that only they could share. The past, the twisted legacy of their father, had come full circle. The woman was just a means to an end. She wasn't important. What mattered was the message, the act, the silence, the control, the power. Amelia turned back to the woman, who was still shaking, her eyes filled with desperation. There was no mercy in Amelia's expression. She had none to give. She stood up and walked to the small wooden table in the corner of the room. From the drawer she pulled out a knife. It gleamed in the dim light, sharp and deadly. It was a tool, a means to an end. The same tool her father had used. The same one that had left the world in silence. The woman began to squirm, her silent screams almost palpable in the stillness. Her hands reached out, trying to stop Amelia, trying to shield her face. But it was futile. The woman's fear was only adding to the weight in the room. Amelia stepped forward, the knife held loosely in her hand. Her fingers gripped the handle tighter. There was a moment of doubt, a flicker of something inside her, but it passed quickly. She had been trained for this. Her father had trained her. The world was nothing more than a game, and the prize was power, the kind of power only silence could bring. As Amelia reached down, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. This was right. This was what needed to be done. The blood, the violence, it was all just part of the ritual, part of the legacy. She could feel her brother's gaze on her, the heat of his eyes burning into her back. He was watching, waiting for her to finish the job, waiting for her to confirm what they both already knew. They were the next in line. The next generation of the tongue collector. Her fingers moved swiftly, her actions precise. The knife touched the woman's skin. A single, smooth slice, and the room was filled with the sound of her blood spilling out onto the floor. But it wasn't just the blood that made the air heavy, it was the silence that followed. A deep, oppressive silence, like the world itself was holding its breath. Amelia stood over the woman, the blood pooling around her feet, and she felt a strange sense of peace. This was the silence her father had spoken of. The kind that crushed you, consumed you, until there was nothing left but control. The woman's eyes began to lose focus as the life slowly drained from her, but Amelia didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She was no longer a girl who had once been forced to witness these horrors. She was now the one who controlled them. Her eyes flicked to Marcus. He stood, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. His eyes gleamed with something almost like satisfaction, but it was more than that. It was a sense of completion. He had done his part. And now it was Amelia's turn. The woman's body shuddered one last time and her eyes closed. Her life had ended in silence, just as it had begun. Amelia stood up, wiping the knife clean on a cloth she had kept beside her. Her movements were calm, methodical. She looked at Marcus one last time, her face unreadable. There was no emotion in her eyes, no remorse. Just the coldness that had taken root in her soul long ago. Marcus walked over to her and without a word, he handed her a small glass jar. It was empty. Amelia knew what to do. She took the jar and walked to the body. The woman's tongue was already cut away, lying in a pool of blood on the floor. Amelia reached down and carefully placed the tongue inside the jar. It was an eerie act, a ritual, but it had become second nature to her. As she sealed the jar and placed it on the table, a quiet satisfaction filled her. The legacy had been completed. Their father's teachings had been fulfilled. But as she turned to face Marcus, something shifted. There was a glint in his eye, something darker, something that made Amelia's skin crawl. It was the same glint she had seen in her father's eyes all those years ago. "I think we should take this further," Marcus said softly, his voice a low whisper. "It's time to make sure our father's work never truly ends." Amelia's eyes narrowed. She didn't speak, but she knew exactly what he meant. The hunger had not been satisfied. It had only just begun. The two of them stood there in the room, surrounded by the silence of their actions, their past, and the weight of their legacy. The story of the tongue collector had not ended. It was only evolving. And in that moment, Amelia knew. Their father's work was alive. It was within them. and it would never die.